but habitat of mango and bargad may not be too different, no? There is some difference, of course, there is some difference. They say wherever banyan tree is, there must be water underneath, right? So there must be some associations, I can understand. So first thing they must have done is, they must have looked at some associations, what is called as phytoassociation, some associations. So obviously, if you have a mango tree somewhere, and if there is natural dispersion of seed, some mangoes are falling down, some birds have thrown them around, or animals have taken them around after taking the juice or whatever, they will sprout. So they might have noticed there were clusters of mango trees somewhere, correct? Correct? There were clusters of guava somewhere. There were clusters of banyan maybe, which is a natural thing to expect. Although you must remember that lotus seed, one of the most viable seed, the longest surviving seed is lotus. And it can travel thousands of miles through the rivers and the storms and retain its viability, isn't it? So not all seeds would have dispersed equally widely, some would have. So it was not a very easy way of doing it. What I am saying is, not all trees will distribute the seeds in neighborhood. There is a very interesting book by Fowler called as Shattering. One of the characteristics they observed, our ancestors observed, was that nature made the wild plants to have a shattering property in the seed. So whenever the seeds mature, they burst to spread the seeds as far as possible. All wild species have this quality of shattering. Domestication has brought in the seed not falling apart. So we have to break this kernel and get the seed out. That's the characteristic generally of domesticated species, species which have been for a long time which have been interacting with human beings. But most of the wild species, if not all, have this shattering ability. Their seed will burst. You've seen in forest those big pods, they curve and scatter the seeds. But those trees like Cassia fistula, Amalthus, has lost the ability of shattering the pods. So you find the whole pod falling down on the ground. Correct? So if you grow one Amalthus, it will still remain one Amalthus till you take out the seed. In our campus, we have many Amalthus trees, but now there is no cluster of Amalthus trees. So the heuristics that they must have used would have been influenced by the pattern recognition. Heuristics must have been influenced by, as somebody said, shape. But shape, how do you see a shape as a pattern? You need to have observations. How do you see observations? You must have a cluster. So clustering might have been one of the first way of classification, isn't it? You cluster things together. Even today we use cluster analysis as a way of classification, isn't it?
Birds of a feather flock together.
That is clustering. Clustering, and you begin to give them names. You start to give them names. The proverbs, the hymns, the legends, the adages which emerged gave us a clue how humankind must have started to see patterns before they had the tools of analysis of variance. So please understand that existence of variance and need to analyze the variance was always there. Tools have varied. My question now is, are we losing the ability to see patterns because we have better tools? we are getting lost in the forest. We do not have very robust heuristics anymore. Imagine a fisherman, as I discussed yesterday, if he has to go in the deep sea and he has to look at multiple parameters about turbidity, temperature, currents, waves, and decide how far to go and when to come back, because he wants to come back every day alive. He must have some computational logic in his mind, but this logic is not based on number crunching. It's based on some association between one or the other. In other words, indicators were developed which gave him a shorthand into of very complex phenomena. So as you know, ladies will say, and it's a well-known example, if you have to take a sample of rice, you will only take one rice and you will be able to tell whether the rice is cooked or not. If it is khichdi, then one rice, one dal. In other words, you don't take 15% sample from a rice bowl to understand whether it is cooked or not. But that is not true for undio maybe, which is a combination of many vegetables. But then what will they do? They will not take sample of each. They will see which is the one which gets cooked the last. Right? They would have some sense which is the one which cooks last. They will only see that. Everything else would have been cooked by the time. That's a thumb rule. That's a thumb rule that look at only one thing and then everything else is taken care of. So this ability to see patterns in nature has been very rich, and the question then arises that this ability, for example, look at the wood. Now we must go toward tools again, and we will see how the tools began to emerge. So let us say you want to make a plow. Now plow has to be used in the soil. How many times? You can imagine every time it has to be plowed maybe 15 days, 20 days, and if it is 1 acre of land, then it will be used 500 times, 500 rows, let us say, once, 500 into 15 days, maybe, you can think of a huge number, which means it must not wear out. So which kind of wood will wear less? Any idea? Huh? Hard? How would you decide? How would you classify? This is a tautology. It is a tautology. What doesn't wear out? Which is hard. What is hard? Which doesn't wear out. Correct? Just give me some other parameter which is independently measurable.
Difficult to extract, difficult to cut, to shape.
Fiber looks dense.
Dense. What? Do you have background biology? Do you have background biology? Anybody who is biology background? Vivek, what is the unit, smallest unit, which will determine the hardwood? Huh?
Mean weight.
But what determines the weight? I mean, why would it, again, hardwood will be dense wood, will be heavy wood. All these are outcomes. Deal with the determining condition. What determines these? Slow growing? Slow growing, okay, but why does it grow slowly? So what is the unit? Huh? What is that? Well, you use the word cell. In cell, right? So that means what? The cell size should be smaller or bigger? Look at the beauty now. the smaller the cell size, slower the growth, heavier the wood. Faster the growth, eucalyptus, bigger the cell size, weaker the wood. Now, if you have, now let us see, we are getting into a very interesting issue. We have to create an institution, a culture which encourages people to grow slow growing species, so that they will have wood to make beams. Before the concrete beams came, you needed a load bearing beam, right? And that beam must be of strong wood. True? When you have to extract oil, I am now compressing, I am going back into last 5,000 years from the 50,000, and I will oscillate between 50,000 and 5,000. So when you have to make oil drums to crush the oil, you don't want wood to be borne out, right? Only the seed to be crushed. So the wood of the drum must be very hard. Correct? The shoe of the plow must be very hard, because that has to rub against the soil every day. True? So we have a problem now. There is a community, and the young fellows in the community say, we have to plant trees because we need wood. And the grandfather says, okay, why don't you grow tamarind? The young fellow says, but tamarind takes a long time. I won't be able to harvest in my lifetime. You couldn't harvest the tamarind tree that you had grown, it is still growing. The old man says, but you know, if my grandfather had not planted the trees, you wouldn't be able to get the hardwood today. But I don't have patience that long. He says, don't you love your great grandchildren? Of course I do. But I'm not worried, they will find out some way. Look at the dialogue, huh? And what would have happened if this dialogue had succeeded in terms of getting the young people to win the argument against the old people? We wouldn't have any hardwood available today. True? There wouldn't be any plows anymore. The desi kikar, a babool, would have been vanished. The vilayati babool would have taken over. Prosopis juliflora would have replaced acacia. Correct? There would be no tree left. So what are we saying? We are saying that when the choice came, so first thing is we classified and we used thumb rules about what is hard, what is soft. And when we said hard, we realized that this is also means very slow growing. Slow growing means it takes long time. So what are we talking about? We are talking about a culture which is able to decide that certain kind of decisions require very long time frame and very uncertain world. We don't know what will happen after 30, 70 years. No way to find out. So you need institutions. You need institutions which create an internal feeling to care for long term. Correct? How do you generate otherwise? You have to have an ethics, isn't it? An ethics must evolve which will say caring for the long term is as much my business as caring for today. So we will spend today the remaining time on this issue and just develop this point about how cultures have dealt with the issue of time frame and the choices. Yesterday we discussed about the volition, right? So I will now try to put together the concept of volition, that is choice, the variability, and I am adding one variable today, which is time frame. Because those of you who have economics background would know that when we do a discounted cash flow, by changing the time frame,